Hello everyone, and welcome to the Real Thread channel. Please consider subscribing and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the Screenity video. The screen flickers to life, immediately plunging us into a world where surveillance is not just accepted, but deeply ingrained. We follow the journey of a protagonist, perhaps someone involved in the very systems that monitor them, or perhaps someone who has simply become aware of the ubiquitous digital gaze. The atmosphere is thick with a sense of unease, a creeping realization that privacy is a relic of the past. As the narrative unfolds, we see glimpses into the lives of several individuals whose stories intersect under the weight of this constant observation. One character might be a low-level technician, someone whose own commitment to privacy is ironic, given their day job of maintaining the very infrastructure that strips it away. We could imagine them having perhaps studied computer science with ideals of building open systems, only to end up maintaining proprietary ones, a common trajectory for bright minds caught in the gears of corporate or state machinery. Another thread follows an activist, someone actively fighting against these invasive technologies. Their work often mirrors the struggles of early digital pioneers who championed free software and decentralized networks, figures who believed technology should empower the individual, not control them. This character's dedication is palpable, fueled by a deep-seated belief in autonomy, but their efforts often seem like Sisyphus pushing a boulder uphill against the endless resources of the monitoring apparatus. The film skillfully weaves in historical context, perhaps referencing early anxieties about data collection or the shift from physical surveillance to purely digital tracking. It reminds us that this wasn't a sudden takeover, but a gradual erosion, built on convenience and the promise of security. Think of the early days of the internet, full of boundless optimism, now contrasted sharply with the current reality where every click leaves a permanent, traceable mark. A particularly poignant section details the psychological toll of living under perpetual scrutiny. People begin to self-censor, modifying their behavior not just when they know they are being watched, but preemptively, internalizing the observer. This speaks volumes about the chilling effect on creativity and genuine expression. It's a familiar narrative trope, but here it feels intensely personal, showing how the public self supersedes the private one. The climax often involves an attempt to disrupt the system, a moment of digital defiance. This isn't necessarily a grand explosion, but perhaps a quiet act of revealing hidden truths, akin to a whistleblower leaking documents, a classic struggle where knowledge itself is the ultimate weapon against opacity. The success of this defiance remains ambiguous, which lends the film its lingering power. We leave not with a feeling of resolution, but with the unsettling question of whether true escape from the digital net is even possible in the modern age, or if the best we can hope for is temporary blindness. The story ultimately serves as a stark mirror, reflecting our own complicity in building the world we now inhabit. The protagonist's eyes, often darting nervously even when alone, betray a constant state of hypervigilance. We see flashes of their past life, perhaps a period of idealistic collaboration on open-source projects during university days, a time when code was seen as liberation. Now, their career path has twisted them into a cog within a massive data processing conglomerate, designing algorithms meant to predict consumer behavior, but which inevitably morph into tools of social profiling. The emotional weight of this contradiction seems to crush them. They move through their modernist, sterile office environment like a ghost haunting their own success. The activist, whose name we might learn is Elira, operates from a deliberately analog space, a cluttered basement studio filled with physical books and humming, heavily shielded electronics. Her inspiration seems drawn from the countercultural movements of the late 20th century, those who first voiced skepticism about centralized power, now transposed onto the digital frontier. Elira's frustration manifests not in shouting matches, but in meticulous, almost obsessive coding sessions aimed at creating ephemeral, untraceable communication channels. She carries the weariness of someone who understands the game is rigged, yet refuses to stop playing for principle. There's a fleeting scene where she receives a message, a digital breadcrumb left by a sympathetic insider, perhaps the protagonist, and the rare spark of hope in her expression is startling against the backdrop of perpetual gloom. The film excels at showcasing the mundane horror of pervasive tracking. It is not the dramatic breach that haunts the viewer, but the gentle, constant stream of personalized advertisements that know exactly what you desire before you consciously acknowledge it, or the automated rejection notice for a job application based on social credit scores, calculated entirely without human intervention. We observe a middle-aged woman, a minor character whose life is quietly dismantled by these systems, once a proud teacher, now marginalized because her past online interactions flagged her as a low-reliability citizen. Her descent isn't sudden. It's a slow starvation of opportunity, mirroring the careers of many artists or thinkers whose unconventional paths failed to satisfy the metrics designed by committee. The narration occasionally dips into historical documents, perhaps excerpts from early memos detailing the perceived benefits of comprehensive data aggregation, the promise of efficiency masking the drive for control. This juxtaposition highlights how easily societal goals can be subtly redefined. The inherent drama comes from the small rebellions, a deliberate misclick, a search query entered in a dead language, an attempt to overload the system with meaningless noise. These small acts of resistance are desperate, private catharses against the overwhelming structure, and they remind us that the human desire for an unobserved existence remains stubbornly resilient, even when technology has made its fulfillment seem impossible. The overall feeling conveyed is less about a fight being won or lost, and more about the continuous, exhausting effort required simply to remain authentically oneself within a system designed to smooth out all interesting edges. The protagonist, let's call him Adrian, carries the distinct scent of ozone and recycled air, the perpetual aroma of server rooms clinging to his clothes even after he leaves the climate-controlled bunkers. His inspiration once lay with the architects of the early internet, the visionaries who envisioned an open global library. That early admiration has curdled into a quiet, seething resentment toward the behemoth he now serves, a corporation whose lobbying power dictates international data policy. We see him interacting with the system not through a friendly interface, but through lines of raw diagnostic code, his fingers moving with a dancer's precision over the keyboard, yet his posture is permanently hunched, as if bracing against an invisible weight. When he pauses to drink lukewarm coffee, his gaze drifts toward the window, searching for something tangible, something that hasn't been cataloged, tagged, and predicted. Ilara's efforts intensify. We learn she was once a promising cybersecurity analyst for a defense contractor, familiar with the very vulnerabilities she now exploits. Her departure wasn't marked by a dramatic resignation. Rather, it was a gradual withdrawal, a refusal to sign off on increasingly intrusive monitoring protocols. Her current mission involves leveraging obscure legacy networking protocols, the digital equivalent of using smoke signals, to bypass the newest generation of AI-driven threat detection. Her inspiration seems rooted in the stubborn endurance of independent journalism during authoritarian regimes, the understanding that information, however fragile, must find a path through the blockade. Her movements are sharp, efficient, born from the necessity of never settling in one place for too long. The closest she gets to vulnerability is a brief encrypted video call with an elderly mentor, perhaps a retired cryptographer who faced similar battles in the Cold War era, offering wisdom filtered through layers of static and delay. The film delves into the societal normalization of this constant feedback loop. We watch scenes where families interact over dinner, each member quietly responding to notifications or optimizing their evening plans based on personalized efficiency metrics delivered to their retinal displays. There is a pervasive emptiness to these interactions. Genuine spontaneity has been replaced by optimized scheduling. The tragedy lies not in rebellion, but in conformity. People aren't forced into obedience. They are incentivized, gently nudged toward behavior that benefits the monitoring structure. An aspiring musician, for example, finds her compositions constantly filtered out of popular feeds because her chord progressions do not align with empirically validated engagement patterns, effectively silencing artistic innovation that deviates from the mean. The moments of tension arise when these carefully managed realities begin to fray. Adrian, in a moment of profound ethical fatigue, doesn't leak data outright, but instead subtly corrupts a single, foundational assumption within the prediction model, a small, almost imperceptible bias injection that might, over months, cause the entire edifice of targeted control to wobble slightly off kilter. It's an act of sabotage so nuanced it can only be understood by another expert. The aftermath is silent. No sirens wail. Instead, there is a momentary digital stutter across the network, a flicker in the otherwise flawless flow of commerce and control, a ghost in the machine that only the insiders, Adrian and perhaps Ilara, can perceive. The film leaves us contemplating whether such minuscule acts of resistance are heroic declarations or merely the dying gasps of a system resisting total entropy, a testament to the stubborn human need to carve out a small, secret space for the self, even when the map of the world shows no such territory remaining. The narrative pivots now to explore the impact of Adrian's subtle sabotage on the periphery, focusing on those least equipped to handle systemic disruption. We follow a community elder, perhaps a retired librarian named Mrs. Albright, whose primary interaction with the digital world was managing her local history archive, ensuring its digitization was both complete and historically accurate, a task she took on with the meticulous care of someone who understands the fragility of memory. Her career was built on classification and quiet preservation, valuing context over speed. Now, the efficiency algorithms that manage her essential services, her power rationing, her subsidized food deliveries, have begun to malfunction subtly, not crashing entirely, but delivering services that are fractionally incorrect. Her medication doses are slightly off. Her heating remains set 1 degree too low for comfort. These aren't system failures that warrant a support ticket, as the system reports everything as nominal. They are the result of the underlying logical framework being perturbed by Adrian's poisoned assumption. Mrs. Albright's anxiety mounts because she cannot articulate the problem. She knows the rhythm of her life, the expected outputs, and when those outputs deviate, it feels like a personal failure of understanding, not a systemic flaw. The film uses her plight to illustrate that surveillance systems are not just about watching the rebels. They are about perfectly governing the compliant majority through flawless optimization. When the optimization wavers, the compliant are the ones who suffer most acutely, lacking the technical vocabulary or the rebellious spirit to fight back. Her inspiration, rooted in the painstaking work of cataloging physical records, shines through in her refusal to simply accept the faulty data. She begins keeping a handwritten log of the discrepancies, using pen and paper, a tangible analog resistance against an ephemeral digital inconsistency. Meanwhile, Ilara, seeing the unexpected digital noise that Adrian introduced, recognizes it not as a malfunction, but as a signal. Her technical intuition, honed by years of anticipating state-level intrusion, tells her this stutter is manufactured, intentional. She must now decipher the meaning embedded within the error, shifting her focus from building escape routes to interpreting the cryptic language of the system itself being compromised from within. This forces a dangerous convergence in their methodologies. Ilara's belief system, forged in the fires of decentralized ideals, now requires her to trust a signal originating from the very heart of the centralized machine she despises. The emotional cost is high. This collaboration means relying on the structure that entraps Adrian, potentially exposing him, Yet it represents the only viable path forward against a surveillance state that is otherwise omniscient. The film subtly suggests that in a world dominated by vast networks, even the purest forms of rebellion must eventually engage with the enemy's infrastructure to effect meaningful change, trading ideological purity for tactical necessity. The collaboration between Adrian and Hilera, though conducted through layers of digital obfuscation and dead drops, vibrates with a tense, unspoken intimacy, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of ethical transgression. Adrian, consumed by the slow decay of his moral compass, finds a strange solace in Hilera's fierce clarity. He views her persistence not as naive idealism, but as the necessary counterweight to the soul-crushing pragmatism of his own existence. He remembers his early engineering projects, the thrill of creating tools for collaboration. Now, his fingers tap out code that feels like laying digital landmines. His current task, driven by Hilera's encoded prompts, involves creating ghost processes, self-erasing scripts designed to mimic benign background activity while secretly rerouting low-priority data streams toward a temporary, encrypted buffer managed by Hilera. This is a game of shadows played inside the infrastructure Adrian helped build, where a single misplaced semicolon could mean immediate termination, or worse, re-education. Hilera, in turn, has to wrestle with the contamination of her principles. Trusting Adrian means acknowledging that the enemy complex is not monolithic. There are fissures, points of human failure within the perfect machinery. Her expertise, originally focused on defensive penetration testing, building walls to keep outsiders out, is now redirected inward, learning to navigate the internal architecture of the very systems designed to keep her marginalized. We see her tracing the lineage of the corrupted data affecting Mrs. Albright. Her investigation reveals that the system isn't merely inefficient, it is actively prioritizing data points deemed high risk for resource allocation, inadvertently starving the low-risk, stable citizens like the librarian. This reprioritization stems directly from the flawed assumption Adrian injected, confirming that the system is achieving its goal of rigid order, just through methods that punish the invisible majority. The emotional core of this section resides in the quiet desperation of Mrs. She stops trying to reason with the automated customer service bots, whose canned reassurances ring hollow. Instead, she begins visiting the physical archives downtown, a place now neglected by the digitally inclined world, a dusty sanctuary where data must be manually verified. She uses her handwritten log, a meticulous chart detailing temperature fluctuations and incorrect nutrient compositions in her food packets, to cross-reference against obsolete physical building schematics she uncovers in the back rooms. Her inspiration is drawn from the historical record itself. She recalls stories of Cold War-era citizens who maintained parallel economies and information networks when official channels became untrustworthy. Her battle is not against technology, but against the authority the technology grants. She fights by insisting on the primacy of observed, physical reality over the smooth, manufactured digital consensus. The climax of this phase involves Hilera successfully diverting a significant amount of diagnostic data, the system's self-assessment reports, into Adrian's temporary buffer. This data is too voluminous to analyze quickly, but Adrian recognizes a pattern in the metadata, a scheduled system-wide maintenance sweep set to occur in 48 hours. This sweep isn't for security. It's a deep optimization cycle designed to purge anomalies, including Adrian's ghost processes and, critically, any irregularities in the lower-tier resource allocation that affect people like Mrs. If the sweep executes, Adrian's contribution will be erased, and the subtle harm to the compliant population will become permanent, locked into the new baseline efficiency parameters. The clock is ticking, forcing Adrian and Hilera to move beyond subtle sabotage toward a visible, coordinated act of exposure before the system cleanses its own wounds. The realization of the impending optimization sweep casts a pall of urgency over Adrian and Hilera's clandestine operations. For Adrian, the 48-hour deadline translates into a physical manifestation of anxiety. He starts experiencing microsleeps at his console, jolting awake to the blinking cursor, terrified that the system might register his momentary lapse in attention. His commitment to this digital rebellion has become an all-consuming fever dream, pushing him past the limits of exhaustion. He is driven now not by guilt, but by a protective instinct for the fragile analog resistance embodied by Mrs. Albright, whose tangible struggle provides a grounding reality missing from his abstract world of code. He sees her handwritten log not as a data point, but as a testament to unquantifiable human persistence. Ilara interprets the maintenance sweep not as an endpoint, but as a window of maximum vulnerability. If the system is dedicating immense processing power to self-correction, its external defenses might be momentarily thinned. Drawing inspiration from the classic infiltration tactics of corporate espionage legends she studied in her defense analyst days, figures known for exploiting planned downtime, Ilara devises a daring plan. They cannot stop the sweep, but they can redirect its output. She tasks Adrian with creating a highly complex, multi-stage payload, not a virus designed to destroy, but an information cascade designed to flood the public information sphere with undeniable contextualized truth. The payload needs a launch vector that cannot be traced back to Adrian's core access points. This leads them to focus on the public-facing diagnostic portals, systems that are robustly monitored, but rarely scrutinized for the content of their routine reports, as those reports are assumed to be automatically validated. Adrian recalls a forgotten subroutine, a diagnostic banner feature originally designed for transparency during system upgrades, now dormant and poorly firewall protected. He sees it as a digital backdoor left ajar by complacent engineering teams years ago, a perfect conduit for information warfare. The focus shifts momentarily back to Mrs. Albright, who, unaware of the digital countdown, stages her own quiet confrontation. Armed with her meticulous logbook, she bypasses the digital interface entirely and shows up at the local energy distribution office, an antiquated brick building still clinging to paper records. The overwhelmed young administrator initially dismisses her concerns, referencing the digital parity reports. But Mrs. Albright doesn't argue metrics. She simply lays out her book, page after page of documented physical inconsistencies, forcing the administrator to confront the tangible discrepancy between the flawless digital readout and lived experience. This analog proof, this insistence on inconvenient reality, provides a small localized pressure point that momentarily distracts peripheral monitoring assets. As the final hours tick down, Adrian executes the payload launch. He doesn't use brute force. He uses persuasion. He designs the scripts to mimic the appearance of standard system error reports, but instead of reporting system status, they begin injecting snippets of photographic evidence, personal testimonies, and redacted internal memos related to data misuse, all sourced from Ilara's deep archives, directly into the banner feeds displayed across public terminals, smart signage, and even private home interfaces. The initial reaction across the network is confusion, a momentary cognitive dissonance as optimized reality clashes with undeniable, inconvenient truth. The film ends not with a bang, but with the unsettling sight of the highly optimized world stuttering, millions of perfectly controlled citizens pausing mid-transaction, looking up from their personalized data streams, seeing fragments of reality injected by ghosts in the machine, realizing for the first time that the seamless world they inhabited was curated and that the curation has momentarily failed. The immediate aftermath of the information cascade is characterized by an eerie silence, a pause in the orchestrated symphony of daily life. The injection of contextualized truth acts like a sudden drop in pressure in a highly pressurized system. People like Mrs. Albright, who were already keenly attuned to the system's subtle errors, experience a moment of validation that is almost religious. For the first time, the invisible friction in their lives has been given visible coordinates. The administrator at the energy office, confronted by the tangible evidence in Mrs. Albright's logbook, coinciding with reports of strange data anomalies flashing on his secondary monitors, experiences a profound shift from bureaucratic indifference to dawning comprehension. His previous inspiration, adherence to protocol, buckles under the weight of undeniable proof presented on yellowed paper. Adrian witnesses the system's initial shockwave from his server bunker. The optimization sweep, slated to cleanse the anomalies, stalls. The sheer volume and contextual layering of the injected data, proof points woven with metadata trails, have forced the system into a defensive feedback loop, prioritizing self-diagnosis over the scheduled purge. This delay is Adrian's narrow window. He knows this reprieve is temporary. The system, learning from the intrusion, will adapt quickly. His internal conflict shifts from escaping detection to ensuring the data cascade continues to propagate beyond the initial burst. He begins feeding the diagnostic streams with highly compressed, self-replicating fragments of the core revelations, embedding them within routine updates sent to unconnected, older infrastructure, digital seeds sown in forgotten corners of the network, relying on the inherent human tendency to investigate anomalies. Ilara, meanwhile, analyzes the system's response pattern. Her initial triumph is tempered by the understanding that the state apparatus possesses immense inertia. She recognizes that simple exposure isn't victory, it's merely the first move in a protracted information war. Her focus narrows to securing the source of the initial infection, the diagnostic banner feature Adrian exploited. She deduces that the system will soon quarantine that vector. Drawing on her past as a cybersecurity expert, obsessed with creating robust, decentralized defenses, she begins preparing a countermove, using the very quarantine protocols now being enacted against Adrian's payload as a temporary shield. If she can spoof the system into believing the threat is neutralized and contained within a sandboxed environment, they might buy days, perhaps weeks, to distribute the full archive through slower, more resilient analog channels she had prepared years ago. Physical data caches hidden globally, accessible only via forgotten protocols. The film emphasizes the societal fracture caused by this sudden illumination. Those who derived their sense of stability and purpose from the system's perceived perfection are thrown into chaos, experiencing a crisis of faith. We see quick cuts of social media feeds, now filled not with curated consumption, but with frantic, unsynced debates, arguments between those who see the leaked data as irrefutable proof of tyranny and others who insist it is sophisticated, state-sponsored disinformation designed to create societal friction, a necessary stress test. Their careers, built upon adherence to the metrics, the successful marketing executive, the data-driven policymaker, suddenly find their entire professional validation evaporating as the metrics themselves are revealed as fraudulent. The tension is no longer about being watched. It's about discerning what is real when the very fabric of consensus reality has been torn. The narrative leans into the ambiguity. The fight has moved from the hidden digital realm to the messy, subjective world of human belief. A battlefield where even undeniable truth can be shouted down by coordinated denial. The transition to the battleground of human belief proves to be the most treacherous terrain yet. Adrian, feeling the strain of maintaining the illusion of system normalcy while secretly feeding the network with seeds of doubt, starts exhibiting physical manifestations of informational overload. His hands, once capable of navigating complex code structures with effortless grace, now tremble visibly when he tries to type simple commands. He starts seeing patterns in the ambient light, flickers that mimic the diagnostic reports, suggesting a blurring of the lines between the digital intrusion he orchestrated and his own perception. His inspiration seems to turn inward. He is desperately trying to preserve the integrity of his own mind, the last space the system has not perfectly mapped. He clings to the memory of a childhood trip to a remote, unmonitored natural preserve, a time before ubiquitous sensors, using that memory as a mental anchor against the chaos he has unleashed. Alara faces the immense psychological weight of coordinating the distribution through analog channels. Her work now resembles that of an early Cold War cryptographer forced to rely on dead drops and shortwave radio bursts. She meets with a small, trusted network of fellow skeptics, retired academics, former librarians like Mrs. Albright's network peers, in physically disconnected locations, exchanging encrypted drives disguised as mundane objects. The risk is astronomical, but the stakes are clear. If they fail to move the data off the actively monitored network before the optimization sweep is rescheduled, Adrian's efforts will have been futile, and the system will have learned precisely how to defend against this type of internal exploitation. Alara's resilience stems from a deep, almost stoic belief in the power of shared, verifiable history. She sees this moment not as a fight against technology, but as a necessary defense of historical accuracy against manufactured consensus. Albright becomes an unlikely, crucial node in this analog network. Having experienced the tangible benefits of her physical logbook, she begins actively engaging her community, not by preaching about surveillance, but by sharing verifiable facts about local resource allocation. The slightly colder apartments, the marginally less nutritious food packets, and showing how her handwritten data contradicts the official digital reports. Her quiet, persistent reality check resonates with the older generation, those whose cognitive framework is not entirely dependent on algorithmic validation. Her calm demeanor acts as a ballast against the rising panic among the general populace who are struggling to reconcile their daily routines with the shocking digital revelations. The narrative emphasizes the irony that the system's attempt to eliminate inefficiency has inadvertently created the perfect conditions for a grassroots physical counter-movement. The very people deemed low risk and therefore receiving the lowest level of digital attention, the elderly, the niche hobbyists, are the ones quietly hoarding the physical evidence needed to sustain the truth when the network inevitably locks down again. The film crescendos as Adrian prepares for the system's anticipated counterattack. He doesn't flee his station. Instead, he uploads a final massive data package, not of incriminating evidence, but of the foundational source code for the diagnostic banner tool he compromised, layered with Alara's decryption keys. It is a final act of radical transparency, forcing the system to either expose its own deep structural vulnerabilities to the public or to aggressively censor this non-incriminating technical data, thereby proving its malicious intent beyond doubt. As the optimization sweep begins to cycle back up, Adrian leans back in his chair, the sterile server room lights reflecting eerily in his exhausted eyes. The outcome is left suspended. The system is either about to achieve perfect self-repair, erasing all traces of their struggle, or it is about to be forced into a public confession of its manipulative design, all thanks to the quiet, desperate actions of two individuals who refuse to let the digital world extinguish the analog truth. The moment the optimization sweep reinitiates, the atmosphere in Adrian's workspace thickens palpably, shifting from panicked urgency to a tense, almost ritualistic stillness. The system, in its immense complexity, hesitates. Adrian's final upload, the source code bundled with Alara's keys, is not an attack demanding immediate erasure, but an ethical paradox demanding classification. It is technically non-malicious data, yet its potential for public understanding is catastrophic to the established order. The system's logic gates stall, wrestling with protocols that mandate transparency of diagnostic tools versus the need for operational secrecy. This computational paralysis gives Adrian a fleeting moment of grace, a digital reprieve where he can observe the machine struggling with its own internal contradictions. Alara witnesses this hesitation through her external monitoring feeds. She recognizes Adrian's brilliance in forcing the system to debate its own foundational laws. Her inspiration, forged in the necessity of operating outside centralized control, now sees the system momentarily paralyzed by its own centralized structure. She acts decisively, deploying the last of her encrypted resources to broadcast the decryption key sequence via extremely low-frequency transmissions, signals that penetrate deep underground and older infrastructure, channels too slow and obscure for high-level AI threat detection to prioritize. This move ensures that even if the network purges the direct files, the keys to unlock the hard cached data in analog caches worldwide will persist. Albright's role culminates not in digital defiance, but in quiet, profound documentation. As the local network flickers, briefly restoring accurate energy readings and ration allotments, she observes the temporary correction. Instead of celebrating, she meticulously notes the exact time the system self-corrected, treating the anomaly and its resolution as two distinct, important data points. Her lifetime of valuing careful record-keeping demonstrates that true resilience lies not just in resistance, but in the disciplined act of remembering the true state of affairs, regardless of the prevailing digital narrative. She embodies the spirit of the historian who meticulously preserves records against censorship, ensuring that the baseline of truth is never entirely lost to convenience or control. The film offers no sweeping victory montage. Instead, the final scenes are fragmented, reflecting the fractured reality left behind. Adrian, having executed his final command, simply walks away from his console. He hasn't disabled the surveillance state. He has merely proven that it is fallible and that its own rules can be weaponized against it. He leaves the server room, stepping out into the city air, which for the first time in years feels perceptibly less sterile, perhaps because the weight of his complicity has lessened, or perhaps because the constant hum of surveillance has developed a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. Ilara, already moved to a new, undisclosed location, watches a single, unverified news feed, a feed she knows is now running on a heavily decentralized, slow network. The broadcast shows public figures awkwardly trying to explain the anomalous data leaks, their carefully constructed narratives dissolving under the weight of cross-referenced, physical proof brought forward by people like Mrs. The feeling imparted is one of exhaustion mixed with nascent possibility. The digital gaze remains vast and powerful, but it has been momentarily blinded by the light of human-verified reality. The story concludes on the note that true freedom might not be found in escaping the network, but in meticulously documenting its errors, forcing the pervasive observer to constantly confront the messy, inconvenient, and ultimately untamable nature of physical existence. The aftermath settles not into a new equilibrium, but into a protracted state of informational ambiguity, a slow-motion societal fever where the reality seen on screens is constantly cross-referenced against the stubbornly persistent facts of the analog world. Adrian, now adrift in the sprawling, anonymized city, finds that his expertise has rendered him unemployable in any overt capacity, yet paradoxically makes him invaluable in the shadows. His former life of clean, predictable algorithms is replaced by a constant triage of fragmented data streams. He focuses his efforts on mapping the system's memory, identifying which anomalies the optimization sweep truly purged and which scars remain deep within the core structure. His inspiration is now purely defensive: how to build digital shelters that mimic the physical solidity Mrs. Albright cherishes, places that defy easy digital indexing. He starts communicating with Ilara not through complex code exploits, but through pattern recognition in seemingly innocuous public data. The rhythmic fluctuations in local traffic flow or the subtle shifts in ambient noise pollution, data points too low priority for the central AI to aggressively monitor for intentional communication. Ilara, having successfully catalyzed the dissemination of the keys, transitions into the role of archivist and educator. Her previous kinetic rebellion gives way to a more patient, long-term strategy, training others to read the digital shadows. Her headquarters are now decentralized, temporary nodes in forgotten public libraries and defunct corporate data centers, places where physical infrastructure still exists, but digital monitoring has become lax due to perceived obsolescence. She teaches workshops, using projection systems powered by diesel generators, demonstrating how to spot the faint digital echoes left by the surveillance state, drawing parallels to the ways authoritarian regimes historically manipulated print media. Her greatest challenge is instilling skepticism without inducing paralyzing paranoia. She aims to foster active discernment, not passive fear. Albright, meanwhile, has become an accidental folk hero in her small sector, the living proof that the system is not omniscient or infallible. Local news outlets, those still possessing a degree of editorial independence, often because their readership base is too small to be worth full algorithmic suppression, begin featuring her. They don't focus on grand theories of surveillance, but on her verifiable, tangible achievements. How she manually cross-referenced her heating records with historical weather patterns to prove intentional under-provisioning. Her impact is measured in the slow, painstaking recovery of community trust, one correctly calibrated thermostat setting at a time. She represents the slow, heavy resistance of established fact against fleeting, manufactured consensus. The film underscores that the battle has fundamentally changed from one of technical superiority to one of cultural persistence. The ruling entities are no longer trying to catch hackers. They are attempting to discredit the very concept of objective, verifiable reality outside their parameters. When the system retaliates, it's not with targeted shutdowns, but with narrative flooding, a deluge of highly personalized, emotionally satisfying, but ultimately fabricated alternative explanations for the data leaks. In the final, lingering shots, Adrian and Alara never physically meet, but their success is evidenced by a collective, subtle shift in public behavior. People start carrying physical notebooks again, not just for aesthetics, but for actual record-keeping. They gather in public squares, not to protest, but to share unverifiable anecdotes, valuing the messy human act of conversation over the optimized efficiency of digital exchange. The pervasive screen light seems slightly dimmer, not because the hardware has changed, but because a significant portion of the population has chosen to look away, prioritizing the tangible, shared presence of one another over the isolating perfection of the digital gaze. The story concludes not with the fall of surveillance, but with the resilient resurgence of the unmonitored human sphere, proving that the most effective countermeasure to pervasive digital control is the stubborn dedication to the physical, verifiable moment. The world settles into a state of wary coexistence, a digital stalemate where the pervasive network continues its operations, but its perceived infallibility has been permanently tarnished. Adrian, now operating under the constant, low-level background radiation of system countermeasures, focuses his energy on creating what he terms digital monasteries, highly encrypted, self-contained micronetworks housed within obsolete air-gapped hardware scavenged from junkyards. His inspiration has evolved from the early liberators of the Internet to the monastic scribes of the Middle Ages, whose purpose was the painstaking preservation of texts during periods of societal collapse. He sees his code not as a weapon, but as protective scripture, designed to survive the coming data purges. He moves with a practiced invisibility, fueled by instant, highly concentrated nutritional supplements, minimizing the need for any traceable public transactions. The occasional flicker of self-reproach surfaces when he considers the sheer entropy his actions introduced, yet it is always suppressed by the memory of Mrs. Albright's determined handwriting filling her logbook. Alara, recognizing that the state's counter-strategy involves suffocating the truth in a sea of fabricated narratives, concentrates on weaponizing slowness. She understands that speed is the surveillance state's greatest ally. Therefore, deliberate inefficiency becomes her tactical advantage. Her training modules, now shared via encrypted bursts across aging satellite uplinks, teach her recruits how to utilize long-delay communication channels, methods so slow they appear to the AI as simple network latency or background chatter. Her greatest triumph is the creation of truth steganography, where verifiable historical documents are embedded within the metadata of publicly available, algorithmically favored entertainment content. A passage from a genuine political treatise hidden within the color gradient analysis of a popular music video. Her dedication mirrors that of early investigative journalists who had to bypass state-controlled printing presses, relying on samizdat, and whispered word of mouth to keep dissent alive. Albright, the unwitting catalyst, is now approached with cautious respect by neighbors who were previously skeptical. She organizes what she calls memory circles, small gatherings where participants are encouraged to read aloud passages from physical books or recount personal histories that directly contradict the system's automated historical revisionism. Her inspiration is drawn from the resilience of oral traditions, the understanding that memory held collectively outside of digital storage is the hardest thing to erase. The system attempts to discredit her by generating hyper-realistic deepfakes showing her endorsing the official narrative. But these fakes fail to convince those who have seen the genuine, ink-stained conviction in her own eyes during the memory circles. The contrast between the flawless, shallow digital simulation and the textured, imperfect human testimony becomes the central cultural conflict. The film portrays the new reality as a constant negotiation. Society hasn't overthrown the censors, but it has learned to build microclimates of privacy within the observable structure. Commercial districts remain heavily monitored, but small community-run physical markets begin to thrive, accepting only physical trade, bartering, or local, untraceable digital tokens created using Alara's decentralized protocols. The underlying theme solidifies. Control is exerted most effectively when the monitored population believes privacy is technically impossible. The resistance, therefore, is the systematic demonstration that the technically possible and the humanly necessary are two different categories of existence. Adrian, Alara, and Mrs. Albright have not won a war, but they have successfully redrawn the borders of the territory that remains human, proving that while the screen can watch everything, it cannot yet consume the will to look away. The visual tapestry, woven by Screenity, immediately signals an immersion into a world both strikingly familiar and subtly unsettling. It operates less as a traditional narrative and more as an extended meditation on the nature of digital existence and curated selfhood. The aesthetic choices, leaning heavily on high-contrast lighting and meticulously framed compositions, echo the visual language of early 2000s digital art while simultaneously adopting the hyper-polished sheen of contemporary social media feeds. This duality is central to its thematic resonance. Consider the protagonist, whose screen-lit visage dominates several key sequences. One senses a deliberate evocation of figures like early YouTube pioneers, those who built nascent personal brands from the ground up, often sacrificing genuine introspection for performative accessibility. The subtle tremor in their hand, visible only in extreme close-up during a moment of supposed triumph, suggests the exhaustion inherent in maintaining a perpetually on persona. This echoes the career trajectory of many influencers who, having achieved a certain level of success through radical authenticity, find the pedestal too slippery to stand upon without artifice. The film positions this digital labor not as creative output, but as a form of perpetual, self-imposed surveillance. The inspiration drawn upon here seems rooted deeply in the psychological thrillers of the late 90s, perhaps flavored with the detached observational style of reality television progenitors. There's a palpable tension reminiscent of early David Fincher, where the glow of the monitor serves not as a window to connection, but as the isolating barrier defining the frame of existence. The pacing, deliberately slow during moments of scrolling and rapid-fire during moments of digital reaction, mimics the attention span fractured by algorithmic suggestion. Furthermore, the film's sound design is crucial. The ubiquitous yet muffled sounds of the digital world, the synthetic clicks, the faint notification chime, the white noise of connectivity, become the ambient score of modern anxiety. When the audio finally drops out entirely, leaving only the sharp intake of breath from the main figure, the silence feels louder than any digital clamor, indicating a complete sensory overload or a moment of profound, unwelcome clarity. The evolution of the on-screen avatar versus the off-screen subject forms the core inquiry. The avatar, perfectly lit and effortlessly charming, represents the aspirational self, a digital idol sculpted from preferences and positive reinforcement. The off-screen reality, hinted at through brief, poorly lit glimpses of mundane surroundings, a forgotten coffee cup, a pile of unopened mail, functions as the shadow narrative. This contrast is not new, but Screenity executes it with a refined, almost clinical detachment, avoiding melodrama in favor of stark presentation. It forces the viewer to confront their own relationship with the mediated image, suggesting that perhaps the most compelling performance we stage daily is the one directed solely at the small, glowing rectangle we carry in our pockets. The film posits that the legacy of this era may not be the content we created, but the extent to which we allowed the act of creation to consume the creator. The protagonist's clothing, often muted grays and blacks, serves as a deliberate visual foil to the blinding vibrancy of the screens they interact with. This intentional visual draining suggests a gradual leaching of personal color, as if the energy required to fuel the digital persona is directly siphoned from the corporeal self. Their movements, often restricted to the small space between the chair and the device, develop a subtle choreography of digital dependence. The slight lean forward in anticipation, the quick, almost involuntary reflex check of the periphery for digital updates, even when the device is temporarily out of sight. This physical manifestation of digital tethering recalls early character studies of obsessive technocrats, though here the obsession is democratized, shared across platforms. We see glimpses of past successes, perhaps a poorly archived video thumbnail flashing briefly across the screen, that reveal an earlier, more overtly enthusiastic version of the individual. That past self, brimming with the naive belief that visibility equated to genuine connection, stands in stark contrast to the guarded, almost defensive posture adopted in the present timeline. This narrative arc mirrors the disillusionment frequently observed in artists or content creators who transition from hobbyist passion projects to full-time market-driven endeavors. The initial spark of pure creation gets overlaid by the demanding structure of metrics and monetization strategies, eventually calcifying into a professional obligation that stifles genuine artistic impulse. The recurring motif of blurred backgrounds in handheld shots underscores the protagonist's selective focus. Everything outside the immediate digital window, the world, relationships, the passage of time, is rendered indistinct and unimportant. This selective vision isn't accidental. It's the practical application of prioritizing the immediate feedback loop. One might draw parallels here to the intense, almost hallucinatory focus required of competitive esports athletes, where peripheral awareness is systematically trained out to optimize reaction time to the immediate screen action, but applied here to the realm of social validation. The emotional register of the film is one of pervasive, low-grade melancholy, punctuated only by brief bursts of adrenaline accompanying notifications. There is no grand breakdown, no cathartic scream. Instead, the exhaustion settles in the eyes, a dry, perpetually strained look that no amount of digital filtering can truly mask. The performance relies heavily on subtle facial musculature, conveying the strain of performing sincerity for an unseen, algorithmically defined audience. It's an exploration of emotional performance art, conducted in private chambers, making the audience feel less like voyeurs and more like unwilling collaborators in the protagonist's slow, luminous burnout. The lingering, unsettling feeling is that the screen has become the only dependable mirror left, and its reflection is increasingly demanding. The protagonist's hands, when not manipulating the interface, often betray a restless energy, fiddling with small objects, a loose thread on their worn sleeve, a discarded paperclip, suggesting an unspent capacity for tactile engagement with the physical world that finds no appropriate outlet. This nervous energy, meticulously observed by the camera in those quiet interstitial moments between digital interactions, speaks to a body perpetually primed for input that never truly satisfies. It's the kinetic residue of hours spent poised for reaction, a physical memory of the scroll and the tap. The film subtly introduces elements suggesting the protagonist's inspiration might have been drawn from figures known for their intense, almost monkish dedication to craft, perhaps emulating the rigorous self-discipline associated with classical musicians or method actors, yet misapplying that discipline to the ephemeral art of digital content. This transference of seriousness onto something inherently transient creates the central tragedy, the profound weight applied to the utterly weightless. We see evidence of past research notes scattered across a desk, visible only when the protagonist briefly pivots away from the light, diagrams perhaps on audience retention curves or demographic analysis, revealing that the initial creative pursuit quickly metamorphosed into a rigorous, self-imposed study of persuasion. Emotionally, the film rarely allows for genuine connection, even with itself. When the protagonist attempts to voice thoughts aloud, perhaps recording a voice note or a quick, unlisted monologue, the delivery is stilted, already edited internally for maximum impact or defensive clarity. This suggests that the internal monologue itself has been colonized by the external audience's anticipated critique. The small, almost imperceptible smile that occasionally crosses their face after posting something deemed successful is not one of joy, but of relieved evasion, the temporary, successful navigation of a social minefield. The few fleeting glimpses of relationships outside the digital sphere, a ringing, unanswered phone displaying a familiar name, a half-eaten meal shared with an empty chair in a previous scene, are treated with the same muted palette as the background clutter. They serve not as emotional anchors, but as evidence of opportunities foregone, sacrifices tacitly accepted in exchange for the immediate, measurable rewards of the screen. The true antagonist isn't a person or a platform, but the vacuum of genuine, unmediated human validation that the screen ironically promises, but can never fully fill. The lingering effect of screenity is the chilling realization that for this character, and perhaps for many viewers, the act of living has become the necessary prelude to the act of documenting, reducing experience to mere potential content. The lighting design often isolates the protagonist's face in a harsh chiaroscuro, reminiscent of Caravaggio's dramatic use of light to reveal internal conflict. Yet here the light source is entirely artificial, a cold, blue-white radiation from below. This contrasts sharply with the warm, diffuse lighting one associates with genuine introspection or comfort. It implies that illumination, in this context, is not about revelation, but about being perpetually visible under scrutiny. The skin appears almost poreless, smoothed over by the digital reflection, suggesting that the protagonist is already existing in a perpetually retouched state, long before any filter is applied. Analyzing the character's relationship with time reveals a profound disruption. The protagonist seems to exist outside conventional temporal markers. The distinction between late night and early morning is erased, marked only by shifts in platform activity cycles or audience engagement peaks. This temporal fluidity mirrors the career ambitions of early tech entrepreneurs who prided themselves on transcending the conventional workday, viewing sleep as a concession to weakness. However, this relentless forward motion lacks direction. It is momentum without purpose, the digital equivalent of running in place, fueled by the adrenaline of the immediate metric bump. There are subtle moments where the influence of performance theory becomes explicit. In one extended shot, the character meticulously cleans their glasses, an action that seems both mundane and ritualistic. This cleaning is not just optical maintenance, it functions as a deliberate pause, a brief, performative self-care break staged for an imagined audience watching their routine. It's the off-stage moment made performative, a nod to the meta-awareness required to constantly manage the perception of authenticity. This echoes the dedication seen in figures like Andy Kaufman, who blurred the lines between reality and fiction so completely that the audience was never sure where the performance ended, though here the motivation is clearly external validation rather than artistic provocation. The soundscape occasionally offers glimpses into the protagonist's intellectual consumption, a snippet of a highly theoretical podcast or an academic lecture playing faintly in the background while they engage in trivial scrolling. This juxtaposition highlights a deep intellectual yearning battling the low-effort engagement required by their current vocation. They are consuming complex ideas, but deploying simplified, easily digestible emotional currency online. This internal friction is the source of the deep weariness that seems etched into the posture, a sense of being too knowledgeable about the mechanism of their own entrapment to genuinely escape it easily. The film suggests that the greatest tragedy is possessing the awareness to critique the cage while simultaneously maintaining the bars. The physical environment surrounding the protagonist, when it manages to break through the screen's dominating presence, is characterized by a studied neglect, bordering on symbolic decay. Dust motes dance visibly in the slivers of ambient light that manage to penetrate the room, illuminated only when they cross the path of the harsh monitor glow, a visual metaphor for how the digital realm only acknowledges the physical world, insofar as it passes through its defining light source. Furniture appears expensive but unused, draped in an almost sepulchral stillness, suggesting that material acquisition has ceased to be a source of joy and now functions merely as the necessary backdrop for the digital performance. This staging echoes the early 21st century anxiety, perhaps channeled from dystopian literature, where advanced technology hollows out lived space, leaving only the necessities for interfacing. We observe moments where the character seems to be practicing inflections or trying out different facial expressions in the darkened screen glass before turning the device on, a silent rehearsal for engagement. This technique reveals an almost industrial approach to emotional output, treating effect as a malleable resource to be optimized for maximum yield. It brings to mind the stringent, repetitive training regimens described in biographies of former Soviet-era gymnasts or classical composers who spent decades perfecting micro-movements. Here, the micro-movement is the subtle widening of the eyes or the precise angle of the chin for the selfie perspective. The inspiration seems drawn from an almost militaristic discipline forced onto a soft, inherently social activity. The film avoids showing any traditional moments of catharsis or genuine breakthrough because, thematically, it argues that such moments are incompatible with the system being depicted. Instead, satisfaction is rendered as fleeting numerical affirmation. When a post performs well, the reaction is a near instantaneous settling of tension, a brief physiological calm equivalent to a required dose of an addictive substance. This reaction is visually depicted not through smiles, but through a momentary relaxation of the jaw muscles and a slowing of the breathing pattern, captured perhaps through the subtle shift in the ambient sound recording. This highlights a key psychological underpinning. The system has successfully redefined well-being as the absence of digital anxiety, rather than the presence of genuine fulfillment. Even the occasional intrusive sound from the outside world, a distant siren, the sound of rain intensifying, is processed through the protagonist's lens of utility. The siren is not a call to empathy or emergency. It is an uncapturable event, something that cannot be monetized or easily curated, and therefore it is dismissed with a flicker of annoyance, a momentary threat to the controlled environment. The protagonist's resistance to the unscripted reality is perhaps the most tragic element, suggesting that they have become more comfortable negotiating the known parameters of digital engagement than navigating the messy, unpredictable sincerity of analog life. Screenity ultimately functions as a chilling mirror, reflecting the gradual, nearly imperceptible trade-off of personal sovereignty for digital visibility. The visual texture of the protagonist's skin, even under the harsh, revealing light, begins to suggest a quality of near translucence, as if the constant bombardment of electronic light is slowly burning through the superficial layers of the corporeal self, leaving something brittle and overly exposed beneath. This physical alteration mirrors the emotional erosion. The lines of expression are no longer formed by laughter or deep thought, but by the constant, slight furrowing of concentration required to parse rapidly changing digital cues. One might observe the protagonist's reliance on a particular ergonomic chair or specialized lighting rig, details that speak to a professionalized commitment far exceeding that of a casual user, aligning more closely with the dedicated, almost monastic environments favored by deep focus researchers or specialized craftsmen, now repurposed for the creation of fleeting online engagement. There is an undercurrent of professional paranoia, subtly conveyed through the protagonist's hypervigilance regarding background noise or reflections. They are aware that the digital frame is porous, that a stray reflection in a darkened screen could betray their true setting or reveal the exhaustion they strive to conceal. This echoes the tension felt by high-level corporate whistleblowers or intelligence operatives whose security depends not just on their actions, but on the integrity of their environment. The film implies that in the age of ubiquitous recording, maintaining an uncompromised private self requires an unsustainable level of environmental control, turning the home into a sterile, temporary set. The inspiration for this carefully controlled performance appears to borrow heavily from the visual diaries of reclusive, highly technical artists who once documented their obscure processes in private journals. However, Screenity flips this inward gaze outward. The protagonist is not refining an esoteric skill for posterity, but broadcasting the process of refinement, turning mastery into a consumable commodity. When the character consults a printed schedule, a rare analog object in the frame, it is not a schedule of personal appointments, but a detailed heat map of optimal posting times across 3 different continents, indicating a profound, almost administrative burden placed upon what was once spontaneous expression. The emotional void is occasionally pierced by the ghost of an unfulfilled personal ambition. Perhaps a brief, silent gaze towards an unused musical instrument or a shelf of untouched literature suggests that the path taken was one of least resistance to immediate reward, a choice made by an individual who once possessed broader, less quantifiable aspirations. This is the quiet tragedy of the unactualized potential, masked by the glittering veneer of digital success. The film suggests that the protagonist is not merely trapped by the platform, but has become the platform's most dedicated shareholder, investing all personal capital into an entity that only offers dividends in ephemeral validation. The silence in the film is therefore not peaceful emptiness, but the tense quiet preceding the next necessary transaction. The protagonist's diet, inferred only through discarded packaging and the ambient sounds of infrequent microwave usage, appears as colorless and processed as the digital light bathing their face. This physical sustenance mirrors the thematic sustenance they seek, low-effort input that requires minimal metabolic or cognitive investment. The lack of fresh ingredients or discernible home-cooked meals suggests a complete outsourcing of life's necessary maintenance to the most efficient, least engaging means available. This aligns with the efficiency ethos often celebrated in the tech industry, where the human element is treated as a variable to be optimized or automated away, even in the realm of basic self-care. A specific recurring visual element involves the protagonist's reaction to external sound. A sudden, sharp jerk of the head when a real-world noise intrudes, like a neighbor slamming a door or an unexpected phone call from an unknown number. These jolts are always followed by a deliberate, almost performative act of recentering. A slow blink, a smoothing of the brow, and then a quick, almost desperate check of the device screen as if confirming that the digital world has remained stable during the momentary lapse of external awareness. This behavior implies that the external reality is perceived less as a context for living, and more as a potential contamination risk to the carefully constructed internal reality presented online. The protagonist treats genuine, unplanned human interaction with the same suspicion one might reserve for malware. The emotional temperature fluctuates based entirely on the engagement metrics displayed. Low engagement induces a state akin to mild hypoxia, a visible slowing of movement, shallower breathing, and a noticeable dulling of the eyes. High engagement, conversely, triggers a fleeting, almost chemical high, characterized by rapid, shallow breaths and an almost manic energy in the finger movements across the interface. This addiction cycle is rendered without moralizing judgment, presented instead as a purely physiological response to a finely tuned stimulus delivery system. This parallels the documented neurological responses of gamblers hooked on variable reinforcement schedules, suggesting that the protagonist is performing a sophisticated, highly personalized form of self-induced Pavlovian conditioning. The film hints at the protagonist's early career aspirations through the titles of books left spine inward on a shelf, a common tactic to suggest intellectual depth without the clutter of actual readership. These titles, perhaps concerning philosophy, systems theory, or even abstract mathematics, underscore the initial intellectual potential that has been deliberately narrowed. The transition from abstract thinking to the concrete, immediate demands of content creation represents a retreat from complexity, a pragmatic surrender to what is immediately legible and rewardable. The irony is that in seeking broad connectivity, the protagonist has embraced a form of intellectual simplification that ultimately isolates them within the most basic feedback loops of digital affirmation. Screenity paints a portrait of a mind capable of vast architecture, currently dedicated solely to crafting exquisite, fleeting sandcastles by the algorithmic tide. The protagonist's interaction with personal hygiene and the reflection in mirrors offers another subtle layer of thematic commentary. There are few overt scenes dedicated to self-care, but when they do occur, they are framed awkwardly, often catching the character mid-motion or obscuring the face entirely. When a full reflection is momentarily captured, perhaps in a darkened window pane momentarily reflecting the room, it is jarring precisely because the physical self seems fundamentally misaligned with the projected image. The body appears slightly heavier, less defined, and profoundly tired compared to the taut, glowing avatar seen on screen. This visual dissonance confirms that the physical self is merely the necessary biological chassis required to operate the digital interface, not an object of care in its own right. This speaks to a form of self-alienation, reminiscent of figures in existential literature who feel disconnected from their own physical vessels, yet amplified by the technology that demands constant physical presence while valuing only the digital output. The sound design, specifically regarding digital communication alerts, evolves throughout the narrative. Initially, the notifications, the pings, the chimes, are sharp and demanding, representing intrusions upon an otherwise quiet, focused state. As the film progresses, these sounds become softer, almost integrated into the baseline auditory environment, suggesting that the protagonist's auditory processing has adapted. They are no longer interruptions, but rather expected rhythms, the very pulse of their existence. When the device finally goes silent for an extended period, perhaps due to a power failure or a deliberate choice, the resulting ambient sound of the room, usually muffled and ignored, rushes in with startling clarity. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic. This unfiltered reality sounds abrasive and alien to the protagonist, who physically recoils, confirming that the self has learned to prioritize the filtered, controlled frequency of the network over the chaotic harmony of the physical world. We can infer that the protagonist's career inspiration may have been rooted in an earlier generation of public-facing professionals, perhaps early television hosts or stand-up comedians who mastered the art of crafting an accessible, repeatable persona. However, where those figures sought laughter or applause from a unified physical audience, this character seeks asynchronous, individualized affirmation across countless microtransactions of engagement. The pressure is decentralized yet constant. A faint, barely audible sigh escapes the protagonist after a highly successful engagement post. It is not relief that the work is done, but the immediate, unconscious preparation for the next round. The realization that the success only guarantees the continuation of the performance, not an end to it. This echoes the biography of figures who achieved massive fame only to find themselves contractually bound to the very image that made them successful, unable to pivot or rest without incurring severe professional penalties. The final sequences often return to extreme close-ups of the eyes, bloodshot and dry, fixated on the screen. The reflected light source itself seems to take on a physical presence, almost burning an imprint onto the retina. This is where the film delivers its final, quiet indictment. The screen, once a tool for projection, has become a lens that refracts reality back onto the user in a distorted, self-consuming loop. The individual is not merely watching content. They are being perpetually refined, polished, and ultimately consumed by the very medium they sought to master. The lingering emotion is not anger or pity, but a profound, chilling recognition of a self willingly subsumed by its own optimized projection. The protagonist's posture, captured often from a slightly low angle that exaggerates their smallness against the vastness of the glowing screen, conveys a sense of perpetual obeisance. Shoulders habitually rounded forward, they possess the physical architecture of someone perpetually leaning into a wind that only they can feel. The wind of expectation generated by unseen metrics. Even when momentarily standing, there is a slight forward lean built into the gait, a kinetic echo of the chair-bound existence. This physicality strongly suggests an internalization of the constraints of digital space, moving as if weighed down by the invisible baggage of millions of potential judgments. This involuntary stoop contrasts with the ideal self presented online, which typically features an upright, confident bearing, a silent testament to the effort required to digitally project verticality onto a physically compromised form. The moments when the protagonist attempts to engage with physical media, perhaps picking up a book or touching an old photograph, are characterized by an almost unnatural gentleness, as if these objects are fragile relics from a forgotten, less demanding civilization. Their fingers, calloused or slightly dry from constant keyboard and glass contact, seem ill-suited to the texture of paper or fabric. This tactile awkwardness reinforces the idea that the primary sensory calibration has shifted entirely toward the smooth, responsive, and immediate feedback of the digital surface. The handling of physical items suggests a yearning for permanence, immediately overridden by the instinctive return to the ephemeral glow of the device, where engagement is instantaneous and quantifiable. In terms of emotional labor, the film meticulously documents the protagonist's management of perceived slights. A single negative comment, buried deep within hundreds of positive responses, is given disproportionate focus. The character will zoom in on this single data point, analyze its language, and often spend significant time constructing a silent rebuttal or an internal strategy to neutralize its potential spread. This micromanagement of negative feedback loop maintenance is the equivalent of tireless, unacknowledged clerical work. This obsession with neutralizing dissent mirrors the behavior of political operatives dedicated to managing minor infractions in highly controlled environments, suggesting the protagonist views their online presence as a fragile political entity requiring constant defensive posture. The film's use of shallow depth of field often renders the protagonist's living space as a collection of blurry, irrelevant shapes, save for the sharp, painful focus on the screen itself. Occasionally, however, the focus will snap sharply onto a single, forgotten object, a child's drawing taped to a refrigerator door, or a faded postcard from a distant relative. These intrusions of uncurated reality are immediately distracting, causing the protagonist to flinch or quickly shift focus back to the screen, effectively erasing the memory of the object with digital light. These moments imply a conscious, repetitive act of self-censorship, sacrificing genuine biographical context for the sake of narrative simplicity required by the content economy. The film posits that true liberation might involve embracing the messy, unfocused context that the protagonist is fighting so hard to visually eliminate. The ambient temperature of the room, suggested only by the faint condensation visible on a nearby glass or the sheen of sweat on the protagonist's upper lip, seems perpetually regulated to the optimal comfort level for extended screen time, ignoring the natural fluctuations of the day. This controlled climate is another manifestation of the protagonist's need to eliminate all physical variables that might interfere with digital output. The very air in the room feels recycled, static, mirroring the sense of stagnation beneath the surface appearance of constant activity. This environment is less a home and more a high-tech, personalized incubation chamber designed solely for the production and dissemination of self. The protagonist's vocal register, when they are forced to speak aloud, perhaps answering a necessary automated prompt or arguing briefly with an automated customer service representative, is marked by an unnerving flatness, devoid of the inflection they deploy so carefully online. This suggests that their authentic voice has atrophied from disuse, or perhaps that the energy required for such complex, high-bandwidth emotional display is too costly when not directly linked to measurable return. The contrast between the vibrant, reactive voice projected through the speakers and the monotone of the actual human speaking is deeply dissonant, serving as an auditory representation of the internal schism. One observes the protagonist occasionally attempting to engage in activities framed as wellness or self-improvement that are simultaneously documented for their followers. A yoga pose is held only long enough for a flattering overhead shot before collapsing into a slump. A brief attempt at meditation dissolves immediately upon the arrival of a low engagement alert. This demonstrates how even restorative activities have been co-opted, stripped of their restorative intent, and repurposed as mere content fodder. Their inspiration here seems tragically misdirected, attempting to apply the relentless optimization inherent in their digital career to areas of life that fundamentally resist quantification. They are trying to schedule serenity, to algorithmically achieve peace, inevitably failing because the process itself contradicts the goal. The physical space often features a conspicuous absence of personal mementos or reminders of deep, long-term commitment. No university degrees prominently displayed. No framed art reflecting enduring personal taste. No evidence of hobbies that require sustained, unobserved effort. This visual void implies a deliberate curation of the past, editing out any history that doesn't feed into the current digital narrative. If the past self was complex, the present digital self must be simple and immediate. The protagonist is living in an aesthetically sterilized present, perpetually preparing for a future that is merely an extension of the current scroll, where the only enduring artifact will be the accumulated, fragmented data trail they leave behind. The chilling implication is that the protagonist has successfully convinced themselves that if an experience isn't documented and distributed, it functionally never occurred. The protagonist's relationship with sleep, or the deliberate lack thereof, is portrayed not as a consequence of hard work, but as a strategic decision, a final frontier of control in a life otherwise dictated by external validation. In the rare instances where the camera lingers on the protagonist momentarily resting their head on the desk, the sleep appears shallow and punctuated, characterized by minor muscle twitches that suggest the subconscious mind is still processing feeds and comments. This near-constant wakefulness functions as a form of performance martyrdom. By sacrificing sleep, the protagonist symbolically asserts their dedication to the digital audience above biological necessity, a testament to a modern asceticism where abstinence from rest replaces traditional forms of self-denial. This mirrors the cult of overwork prevalent among early venture capitalists, now adapted to the realm of personal media saturation. When interacting with food, the process is always swift and pragmatic, suggesting sustenance is merely fuel for the next content cycle, not an occasion for pleasure or social ritual. They might consume energy bars or quick prep meals, often eaten standing or while scrolling, the mastication barely registering. This physical neglect suggests a profound disconnect from the body's immediate needs, a prioritization of abstract metrics over tangible well-being. The muted colors of the food itself, beige, white, processed browns, serve as a further visual anchor for the theme of sensory deprivation, where flavor and texture have been traded for convenience and speed, mirroring the trade-off made with complex emotional experiences. A subtle but persistent auditory clue is the faint, distorted sound of their own past content playing back, perhaps an accidental autoplay or a deliberately reviewed highlight reel. These sounds are often tinny, almost like hearing a memory through a bad telephone connection. When the protagonist registers these echoes of their former self, there is no visible nostalgia, but rather a flicker of self-criticism, as if judging an earlier, less polished iteration of the brand. This internal editing process, where the past self is constantly auditioning for the approval of the present, reveals a paralyzing lack of self-acceptance outside the context of active production. The past is not a history to learn from, but a database of potential liabilities to manage. The film introduces a recurring visual device, the protagonist briefly touching the glass surface of the screen with their fingertips, not in a gesture of affection, but as if testing its temperature or structural integrity. This touch is always brief, almost hesitant, suggesting a profound uncertainty about the boundary between the physical operator and the digital output. It evokes the tactile anxiety of an engineer constantly checking the stability of a complex, delicate machine upon which their livelihood and identity rests. The lingering implication is that the screen is not a window they look through, but a surface they are perpetually trying to adhere to, lest they slip away into the unrecorded void behind them. The tragedy lies in this endless, exhausting quest for frictionless integration with a system designed to perpetually demand friction. The protagonist's few instances of genuine, unplanned laughter are jarringly out of place. Brief, sharp bursts that sound almost like a malfunction, quickly choked back down into professional composure. These genuine eruptions are invariably triggered by something completely divorced from their online world. A silly commercial playing quietly on a background television, an absurd anecdote recounted by a fleeting delivery person, or perhaps a memory surfacing unbidden. The immediate recovery from this natural expression is swift and brutal. The mouth clamps shut. The eyes dart to the screen to ensure no unauthorized audio was captured, and the energy that fueled the laughter is immediately redirected into refining the existing digital narrative. This reveals a deep-seated fear that authenticity, in its raw form, is fundamentally unmarketable and therefore dangerous to the carefully constructed facade of controlled contentment. The character's handwriting, glimpsed only when signing for a package or jotting down a quick, forgotten physical note, is brittle and angular, appearing as sharp and inefficient compared to the sleek typography dominating their digital life. The loops and curves of natural script look alien and cumbersome to hands accustomed to the smooth, binary precision of digital input. This physical clumsiness with analog tools underscores the theme that the protagonist has willingly traded motor skills associated with deep, patient craft for the rapid, shallow dexterity required for instantaneous digital reaction. The pen strokes seem burdened, heavy, as if resisting the very act of leaving a permanent, uneditable mark on physical space. The emotional cost of maintaining this vigilance manifests in phantom sensations. The protagonist is frequently seen subconsciously reaching for their pocket or checking the empty wrist where a smartwatch might have been, even when the device is clearly in front of them. This indicates a neurological habituation to the potential for connection, the expectation of incoming data, making the absence of alerts feel like a physical loss rather than a reprieve. It's the restlessness of a limb amputated, but still feeling the ghost of a crucial tool. The body anticipating the vibration that signals relevance. The curated professional interests listed on their profile, perhaps obscure historical figures known for intense focus or complex philosophical concepts, stand in stark, mocking contrast to the reality of their daily engagement, which revolves around trivial disputes or the timing of ephemeral trends. This disparity suggests an ongoing performance of intellectualism designed not to attract peers, but to satisfy the opaque filtering mechanisms of recommendation algorithms that favor high-minded keywords. The ultimate irony is that the protagonist is performing intellectual labor for an audience whose primary metric is purely superficial engagement, a complex deception played out on the simplest of platforms. The film suggests that the protagonist is performing for the algorithm, viewing it not as a tool, but as the highest-order critic whose unknowable preferences govern their entire existence. The protagonist's attempts at physical exercise are equally compromised by their performative nature. When glimpsed engaging in physical activity, perhaps a few clumsy stretches near the periphery of the frame, it is clearly a calculated effort toward a potential morning routine content piece, rather than a genuine pursuit of fitness. The movements are stiff, executed with a focus less on muscle engagement and more on achieving a visually pleasing line for an unseen camera angle. If they use weights, they are often lightweight or decorative, serving as props that signal discipline without demanding actual physical exertion. The moment the recording light blinks off, or the perceived window for documentation closes, the weights are dropped with palpable relief, often landing with a dull thud that briefly disturbs the sterile quiet, only to be quickly suppressed by a renewed focus on the screen. This inability to separate self-care from self-marketing highlights a worldview where intrinsic reward is non-existent. If an action isn't broadcastable, it offers no measurable value. The film subtly employs visual motifs of reflection and transparency that continually undermine the protagonist's constructed reality. When they open blinds to check the weather, a rare acknowledgement of the external environment, the sunlight is so offensively bright that they immediately recoil, shielding their eyes as if exposed to radiation. Yet the ambient digital light, cold and pervasive, is accepted without resistance. This suggests a deep-seated phobia of unmediated reality. Sunlight is messy, unpredictable, and cannot be adjusted via a brightness slider, whereas the blue light is a known, controllable entity. This aversion to natural illumination implies that the protagonist fears the truth that the sun exposes, namely the reality of their isolation and the artificiality of their daily existence. There are moments when the protagonist interacts with technology that they do not control. A mandatory system update, a buffering screen, or a temporary internet outage. During these technological interregnums, a raw, almost animalistic anxiety surfaces. The stillness is agonizing. The hands, deprived of their familiar input source, become dangerously agitated, perhaps gripping the edges of the desk until the knuckles whiten, or tracing frantic, pointless patterns on the dead screen surface. This visceral panic confirms that the digital interface is no longer a tool or a platform. It has become the very infrastructure of their consciousness. When the connection is abruptly restored, the return to activity is not a relief, but a sudden, necessary redirection of panic, like a dam breaking, flooding the system with frantic scrolling to reassure the nervous system that the lifeline is reattached. The characters' aesthetic choices in decor, minimalist, monochrome, and hyper-organized, are not expressions of personal taste, but rather strategic decisions to minimize visual noise that might distract the audience or interfere with the clean lines required for photographic composition. Every item in the frame seems to have been vetted for its potential as background texture. Yet, buried deep within a drawer, or glimpsed in a heavily shadowed corner, one might spot a single, vibrant, deeply saturated object, a brightly colored, seemingly random souvenir, or an old, worn paperback with a garish cover. This single splash of uncurated color represents the ghost of the unedited self, an aesthetic impulse forcibly suppressed because it does not align with the muted professional brand identity. It is the visual equivalent of the suppressed, awkward laughter, a tiny, defiant spark of the authentic self struggling to survive within the perfectly calibrated container of manufactured visibility. Screenity suggests that the maintenance of this facade requires not just effort, but the constant, low-grade self-erasure of anything too real, too colorful, or too human. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Real Thread channel. Please consider subscribing and hitting that like button if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the Screenity video. The screen flickers to life, immediately plunging us into a world where surveillance is not just accepted, but deeply ingrained. We follow the journey of a protagonist, perhaps someone involved in the very systems that monitor them, or perhaps someone who has simply become aware of the ubiquitous digital gaze. The atmosphere is thick with a sense of unease, a creeping realization that privacy is a relic of the past. As the narrative unfolds, we see glimpses into the lives of several individuals whose stories intersect under the weight of this constant observation. One character might be a low-level technician, someone whose own commitment to privacy is ironic, given their day job of maintaining the very infrastructure that strips it away. We could imagine them having perhaps studied computer science with ideals of building open systems, only to end up maintaining proprietary ones, a common trajectory for bright minds caught in the gears of corporate or state machinery. Another thread follows an activist, someone actively fighting against these invasive technologies. Their work often mirrors the struggles of early digital pioneers who championed free software and decentralized networks, figures who believed technology should empower the individual, not control them. This character's dedication is palpable, fueled by a deep-seated belief in autonomy, but their efforts often seem like Sisyphus pushing a boulder uphill against the endless resources of the monitoring apparatus. The film skillfully weaves in historical context, perhaps referencing early anxieties about data collection or the shift from physical surveillance to purely digital tracking. It reminds us that this wasn't a sudden takeover, but a gradual erosion, built on convenience and the promise of security. Think of the early days of the internet, full of boundless optimism, now contrasted sharply with the current reality where every click leaves a permanent, traceable mark. A particularly poignant section details the psychological toll of living under perpetual scrutiny. People begin to self-censor, modifying their behavior not just when they know they are being watched, but preemptively, internalizing the observer. This speaks volumes about the chilling effect on creativity and genuine expression. It's a familiar narrative trope, but here it feels intensely personal, showing how the public self supersedes the private one. The climax often involves an attempt to disrupt the system, a moment of digital defiance. This isn't necessarily a grand explosion, but perhaps a quiet act of revealing hidden truths, akin to a whistleblower leaking documents, a classic struggle where knowledge itself is the ultimate weapon against opacity. The success of this defiance remains ambiguous, which lends the film its lingering power. We leave not with a feeling of resolution, but with the unsettling question of whether true escape from the digital net is even possible in the modern age, or if the best we can hope for is temporary blindness. The story ultimately serves as a stark mirror, reflecting our own complicity in building the world we now inhabit. The protagonist's eyes, often darting nervously even when alone, betray a constant state of hypervigilance. We see flashes of their past life, perhaps a period of idealistic collaboration on open-source projects during university days, a time when code was seen as liberation. Now, their career path has twisted them into a cog within a massive data processing conglomerate, designing algorithms meant to predict consumer behavior, but which inevitably morph into tools of social profiling. The emotional weight of this contradiction seems to crush them. They move through their modernist, sterile office environment like a ghost haunting their own success. The activist, whose name we might learn is Elira, operates from a deliberately analog space, a cluttered basement studio filled with physical books and humming, heavily shielded electronics. Her inspiration seems drawn from the countercultural movements of the late 20th century, those who first voiced skepticism about centralized power, now transposed onto the digital frontier. Alara's frustration manifests not in shouting matches, but in meticulous, almost obsessive coding sessions aimed at creating ephemeral, untraceable communication channels. She carries the weariness of someone who understands the game is rigged, yet refuses to stop playing for principle. There's a fleeting scene where she receives a message, a digital breadcrumb left by a sympathetic insider, perhaps the protagonist, and the rare spark of hope in her expression is startling against the backdrop of perpetual gloom. The film excels at showcasing the mundane horror of pervasive tracking. It is not the dramatic breach that haunts the viewer, but the gentle, constant stream of personalized advertisements that know exactly what you desire before you consciously acknowledge it, or the automated rejection notice for a job application based on social credit scores, calculated entirely without human intervention. We observe a middle-aged woman, a minor character whose life is quietly dismantled by these systems, once a proud teacher, now marginalized because her past online interactions flagged her as a low-reliability citizen. Her descent isn't sudden. It's a slow starvation of opportunity, mirroring the careers of many artists or thinkers whose unconventional paths failed to satisfy the metrics designed by committee. The narration occasionally dips into historical documents, perhaps excerpts from early memos detailing the perceived benefits of comprehensive data aggregation, the promise of efficiency masking the drive for control. This juxtaposition highlights how easily societal goals can be subtly redefined. The inherent drama comes from the small rebellions, a deliberate misclick, a search query entered in a dead language, an attempt to overload the system with meaningless noise. These small acts of resistance are desperate, private catharses against the overwhelming structure, and they remind us that the human desire for an unobserved existence remains stubbornly resilient, even when technology has made its fulfillment seem impossible. The overall feeling conveyed is less about a fight being won or lost, and more about the continuous, exhausting effort required simply to remain authentically oneself within a system designed to smooth out all interesting edges. The protagonist, let's call him Adrian, carries the distinct scent of ozone and recycled air, the perpetual aroma of server rooms clinging to his clothes even after he leaves the climate-controlled bunkers. His inspiration once lay with the architects of the early internet, the visionaries who envisioned an open global library. That early admiration has curdled into a quiet, seething resentment toward the behemoth he now serves, a corporation whose lobbying power dictates international data policy. We see him interacting with the system not through a friendly interface, but through lines of raw diagnostic code, his fingers moving with a dancer's precision over the keyboard, yet his posture is permanently hunched, as if bracing against an invisible weight. When he pauses to drink lukewarm coffee, his gaze drifts toward the window, searching for something tangible, something that hasn't been cataloged, tagged, and predicted. Ilara's efforts intensify. We learn she was once a promising cybersecurity analyst for a defense contractor, familiar with the very vulnerabilities she now exploits. Her departure wasn't marked by a dramatic resignation. Rather, it was a gradual withdrawal, a refusal to sign off on increasingly intrusive monitoring protocols. Her current mission involves leveraging obscure legacy networking protocols, the digital equivalent of using smoke signals, to bypass the newest generation of AI-driven threat detection. Her inspiration seems rooted in the stubborn endurance of independent journalism during authoritarian regimes, the understanding that information, however fragile, must find a path through the blockade. Her movements are sharp, efficient, born from the necessity of never settling in one place for too long. The closest she gets to vulnerability is a brief encrypted video call with an elderly mentor, perhaps a retired cryptographer who faced similar battles in the Cold War era, offering wisdom filtered through layers of static and delay. The film delves into the societal normalization of this constant feedback loop. We watch scenes where families interact over dinner, each member quietly responding to notifications or optimizing their evening plans based on personalized efficiency metrics delivered to their retinal displays. There is a pervasive emptiness to these interactions. Genuine spontaneity has been replaced by optimized scheduling. The tragedy lies not in rebellion, but in conformity. People aren't forced into obedience. They are incentivized, gently nudged toward behavior that benefits the monitoring structure. An aspiring musician, for example, finds her compositions constantly filtered out of popular feeds because her chord progressions do not align with empirically validated engagement patterns, effectively silencing artistic innovation that deviates from the mean. The moments of tension arise when these carefully managed realities begin to fray. Adrian, in a moment of profound ethical fatigue, doesn't leak data outright, but instead subtly corrupts a single, foundational assumption within the prediction model, a small, almost imperceptible bias injection that might, over months, cause the entire edifice of targeted control to wobble slightly off-kilter. It's an act of sabotage so nuanced it can only be understood by another expert. The aftermath is silent. No sirens wail. Instead, there is a momentary digital stutter across the network, a flicker in the otherwise flawless flow of commerce and control, a ghost in the machine that only the insiders, Adrian and perhaps Ilara, can perceive. The film leaves us contemplating whether such minuscule acts of resistance are heroic declarations or merely the dying gasps of a system resisting total entropy, a testament to the stubborn human need to carve out a small, secret space for the self, even when the map of the world shows no such territory remaining. The narrative pivots now to explore the impact of Adrian's subtle sabotage on the periphery, focusing on those least equipped to handle systemic disruption. We follow a community elder, perhaps a retired librarian named Mrs. Albright, whose primary interaction with the digital world was managing her local history archive, ensuring its digitization was both complete and historically accurate, a task she took on with the meticulous care of someone who understands the fragility of memory. Her career was built on classification and quiet preservation, valuing context over speed. Now, the efficiency algorithms that manage her essential services, her power rationing, her subsidized food deliveries, have begun to malfunction subtly, not crashing entirely, but delivering services that are fractionally incorrect. Her medication doses are slightly off. Her heating remains set 1 degree too low for comfort. These aren't system failures that warrant a support ticket, as the system reports everything as nominal. They are the result of the underlying logical framework being perturbed by Adrian's poisoned assumption. Mrs. Albright's anxiety mounts because she cannot articulate the problem. She knows the rhythm of her life, the expected outputs, and when those outputs deviate, it feels like a personal failure of understanding, not a systemic flaw. The film uses her plight to illustrate that surveillance systems are not just about watching the rebels. They are about perfectly governing the compliant majority through flawless optimization. When the optimization wavers, the compliant are the ones who suffer most acutely, lacking the technical vocabulary or the rebellious spirit to fight back. Her inspiration, rooted in the painstaking work of cataloging physical records, shines through in her refusal to simply accept the faulty data. She begins keeping a handwritten log of the discrepancies, using pen and paper, a tangible analog resistance against an ephemeral digital inconsistency. Meanwhile, Ilera, seeing the unexpected digital noise that Adrian introduced,